Today we're going to talk about politics. This is one of my favorite subjects, and it's certainly appropriate for this time. We're only going to go, as usual, halfway through the chapter this week. So the chapter title is Power, Politics, and Social Order. And we're only going to do the first section initially. But what we're going to be addressing in this chapter, the whole chapter, is how does public power manifest itself cross-culturally? How does the idea of government and who's in charge and how that works, how does that look cross-culturally? The second one is, how do cultures maintain social order and deal with conflict? That's an important question. And then the third is, how is globalization changing public power and relations? So the chapter covers what are called political and legal anthropology. So this first section we're working on is what's called political anthropology, and it addresses that area of human behavior and thought that's related to public power. Who has it? Who doesn't? The degrees of power, the bases of power, this is a biggie, abuses of power, and the relationships between political and religious power, political organization and government, social conflict, social control, and morality and law. Wow, that's a tall order, isn't it? And I don't know if you've ever thought about the political world covering all of those areas and aspects of social life, but of course they do. It does, politics. Next week, what we're going to look at is what's called legal anthropology, which is the study of how we maintain social order and how we resolve conflict. Just for an example, one of the ways we maintain social order is through the court and prison system, right? That's one way. So that we'll be looking more at that type of thing. And then the last section has examples of change in politics and political order, something we're dealing with right now in our world. Well, the whole world is, right? I was going to say our country, but the whole world is right now. So the first section here that we're talking about is public power, political organization, and leadership. Now, anthropologists have a much broader view of politics, but they have a much broader view of everything generally, but certainly of politics than political scientists do, for example, because the anthropologist is interested not only in the workings of politics, but in also the behavior and thought that is inherent in political systems. So what is politics? Politics is the organized use of public power. What's power? The ability to bring about results with the potential and or actual use of force. Okay. And authority is the ability to bring about results based on a person's status, respect, and reputation in the community. It differs. Do you notice how different that definition is than the definition of power? The difference between authority and power. Power is the ability to bring about results with the potential and or actual use of force. And authority is the ability to bring about results based on a person's status, respect, reputation in the community, and it differs from power in two ways. The first is, I just reiterated, power is backed by potential use of force. And the second is that power can be widened by an individual who lacks authority. I'm sorry, not widened, wielded. Power can be used by an individual who lacks authority. So you may not have the respect, right? You may not have the status. You may not have the reputation. If you have the guns, or the equivalent, okay, then you can wield power that way. So we've got power, authority, and now influence. Influence is the ability to bring about results by exerting social or moral pressure. Unlike authority, influence can be exerted from a lower status or marginal position. Okay. But all three, power, authority, and influence, they're all relational. They all exist in relation to other people. What can you get other people to buy into? What can you get other people to do? How can you get other people to listen to you in order to influence them? Can you see how relational that all is? So power has the greatest likelihood of existing in what's called a coercive and hierarchical relationship. What does that mean? Coercive means force. So you're going to find power in a situation where there's the ability to force someone to do something or a population to do something, and where there's a hierarchy that's highly respected, somebody, not respected, that was the wrong term to use, where there's somebody who has a strata in a hierarchy, and the higher one is in that hierarchy. If you're the top person, especially, then you can wield power. Okay, you can force people to do things. Now, authority and influence are very different. They allow for a democracy, right? They have the most options for consensual, cooperative decision making, which is the main characteristic of democracies. I'm going to read that again to you. Consensual, cooperative decision making. Okay, that is influence and authority, not power. Okay. So power, authority, and influence, all three of them, are related to politics. And power, once again, to reiterate, being the strongest basis for action and decision making. So now we're going to look at political organization, what that is and what that means. Political organizations are groups within a culture that are responsible for decision making and leadership, maintaining social cohesion and order, protecting group rights, and ensuring safety from external threats. Now, if you think about some of those, it could be the Congress, it could be the military, it's all of those are political organizations. There was something else I was going to say, but now I forget. Safety from external threats, protecting group rights. Okay, that's the law, protecting group rights. Okay, there's 4 types, and those 4 types of political organization occur cross-culturally, and they're based loosely on modes of livelihood. Once again, isn't it interesting how practically every chapter with something we look at, it's related to how you make a living, basically. And so the 4 types of political organization are the band level, tribe, chiefdoms, and states. That's the 4. And the band levels, as you might guess, are associated with foragers. Remember that modes of livelihood chart we looked at, okay? So foraging groups have a flexible membership and very minimal leadership, okay? There's typically only between 20 and, at the max, a few hundred of people in a band. And they're all related some way or the other through kinship. So band membership is the most flexible kind. You in situations or disagreements with another person or a spouse, you can just leave and join another band, and there's no repercussions for that. I'm out of here. I'm going to go join this other band for a while. You may come back, but that flexibility is what's inherent in the band level. Leadership is equally informal. So there are no permanent leaders. Whoever leads something is based on an event, something that's going to be happening or does happen, or their expertise. They're the best hunters. They're the best. They know where the best foraging is. They know where the best camping is. Whatever, that type of thing. All members of the band, this is so important, are social equals. So there's no hierarchy. Remember how power/force had to do with hierarchy, some big honcho who could make you do something. At the band level, everybody is a social equal. The band leader, during the time that they're the leader for whatever, remember that's temporary, so there's no permanent leader, but at whatever point and for whatever event they're the leader, don't have any higher social status than everybody else in the band. They might have a degree, as your text points out, of authority or influence. Like they're a respected hunter. That respect is authority and influence, a respected storyteller. But they don't have power. They can't force other people in the band to accept their views. And in a band level of political decision making, things like, shall we move now or in a couple of weeks, like so migration, food distribution, and the resolution of personal conflicts, that's what any political activity is around. Things that come up in the band and that are important to their livelihood and survival, like migrating or food distribution. And certainly personal conflicts can cause a lot of, issues within remember, these are small groups, 20 to a few hundred people. Conflicts between the groups of bands is extremely rare. There's no such thing as warfare or raiding or any of that kind of thing. And much of that is due to the fact that they're usually widely separated, these bands, and there's very low population density. And you can see from this description that, as your book puts it, the band barely qualifies as a form of political organization. And some anthropologists don't think it is a form of political organization, but it's in all textbooks as the foundational, original form of something we can very loosely call political organization. But part of the reason that some anthropologists don't feel as though it qualifies is that there's such flexible leadership that you can't really point out a leader distinctly, and there aren't any signs or emblems or anything that associates one with any kind of political affiliation of any kind. So that's bands. Now, tribes are the next step up in terms of complexity of political organization, and that's a combination of several bands or lineage groups that come together, but they have a similar language and lifestyle, and they occupy a distinct territory. If you think about the Plains Indians, they were all Plains Indians. They all hunted buffalo. They all lived in teepees, et cetera, but they had certain dialects. They were the Teton Sioux and other types of Sioux, and, depending on the territory they were in. So the tribes are affiliated and based on their form of political organization is also based on kinship. It's the primary basis for membership. And they range in size from 500 to several thousand people. You find them in the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, parts of Africa, and Native Americans, as I just mentioned. So the tribal headman, and they use the term headman because they point out they're most of them are male, and it's a more formal position than a band leader. I want to go back to the Iroquois and some of the other Native American tribes. Remember, we learned that leaders were male, but it was the women who chose them in many, many cases and had a lot of decision and making authority. So they're mostly male leaders, and listen to this, don't you wish these were must-have characteristics of our leaders? They must be hardworking, generous, and have good personal skills. Even in a tribe, when we're talking about 500 to several thousand people, this was a part-time basis position, if you will, to be the tribal leader. Our Western terminology is chief. It's not necessarily accepted by all indigenous peoples as the correct terminology. It's not their term, but if you're thinking what I'm talking about, that's what I'm talking about. It's a part-time basis only. And their responsibilities are more demanding than a band leader. Remember, this is a much bigger population that we're talking about. So it often has to do with moving herds if they're herders, hunting if they're hunters, like the Sioux were, planting, harvesting, seasonal feasts, celebrations. All of those things have to be managed and arranged. And also internal and external conflict resolution. When you get to tribes, now you're getting into raids and minimal warfare generally, but more like raiding and that type of thing. And so here's the other really important aspect of this, which I always think of as well with our modern politics and wishing that this were true, that the leader, the chief, if you will, relies on authority and persuasion, not power. Native Americans say that the leaders are in a position of responsibility, not power. Now, if we could just have that ethic, that mantra going, okay, why do I want to run for office? Is it because I want power, or because I understand that it's a position of responsibility and I want to make things better for people, basically? Can you see the difference in value there between power or responsibility? So they mention the big man, big woman leadership possibilities here in your text as a small point. And that's a form of political organization that's kind of midway between a tribe and a chiefdom. It involves reliance on the leadership of key individuals, and in some cultures it's a big woman as well, in others it's big man. So it's a woman with key individuals who have a political following. And those political followings are through personal ties and familial ties, tribal connections, and they often have what are called redistributive feasts. Now, if you look at the indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest, some of you may be familiar with potlatches. What made you a big man in a culture that practiced potlatching, which is pretty much further north from here up the coast, starting around Portland and the Chinook and all those folks, and then up into Canada and Southeast Alaska, you might spend a year collecting stuff that you would then give a big feast, a potlatch, and give everything away. And that's where your status came from. Then you were the big man, the tribal leader for a while. So now we're going to move to chiefdoms, okay? That's the third stage in this. You notice this has to do also with size of population. So that's a form of political organization that includes permanently allied tribes and villages, and it's under one chief who possesses power. And this is why I said applying the term chief to the tribe level was inaccurate, because you see now the definition of chiefdom. It includes permanently allied tribes and villages under one chief who possesses power. Now we're at power. Okay. So it's larger populations than tribes. It's much more centralized, much more socially complex. There are hereditary systems of ranking and economic stratification. Those things are a central feature of tribes. Some people have more than others. You have a socially stratified society. And the chiefs and their descendants have a much higher status than the commoners. It's often a hereditary position, and intermarriage between different stratas of society is forbidden, so everybody stays in their level, socioeconomic and privilege level. So the chiefship is an office, and it has to be filled at all times. So this is very different, you can see, than the band and the tribe level. When the chief dies or retires, they must be replaced. And they have many more responsibilities than tribal leaders. They regulate the production of whatever is being produced. Generally, it's the food production, but there are other things going on as well often. Redistribution, how does that production of things, and food being primary, how does that get redistributed? The chief solves conflicts, and it plans and leads raids and war. Here we are now with war for the first time. And what are the criteria to determine the chief? Well, there's both ascribed and achieved statuses associated with becoming a chief. The ascribed status is your birth, your lineage, as we just talked about, your descendants. So it's often the first son. In some cultures, it can be a daughter. That's not as common, obviously, but a descendant of the chief, and the closer to an immediate descendant, the better. That's the ascribed one. The achieved one is having some kind of personal leadership skills, charisma, accumulated wealth. That one is the same as our modern leaders all over the world, personal leadership skills, charisma, accumulated wealth, etc. So that is the third stage of chiefdoms. And now we're at states, which is what, we are. By the way, states do not mean states like we think of them in the United States. A country is a state. And so just so you know that terminology. A state is a centralized political unit, which includes many communities and territories. That's where the large piece of, like a country, comes in. A bureaucratic structure, and leaders with, get this, coercive power. Now we're at the level where the chiefdoms have some coercive power. Now we're at the level where it's a key characteristic of being a leader, is having power that can force the population in certain areas and ways. It also involves symbols of state power. You're in a state when you see lots of symbols, flags, and a variety of other things, buildings, So the religious beliefs and symbols are often closely tied to state leadership. And the leader may actually be a deity. In ancient Egypt, that was certainly true. In other cultures as well, but that's the one most of us are most familiar with. So you're not only the king or the pharaoh, you are the high priest of the religion. You are, in the case of Egypt, you are a reincarnated or incarnated god. And so if you think about the Queen of England, I know that's a big leap, but she's the head of the Church of England, right? That's one of her main characteristics, is that whoever the monarch is in England is the head of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Also, there are symbols such as architecture and urban planning that reminds citizens of the greatness of the state. If you even think about our Capitol building and what that means in the White House and the Lincoln Memorial, all of those things are major symbols of the state, particularly the Capitol and the White House. Those are the two biggies for us. And they remind us, of the greatness of the state. The Vatican is another example. It's a state within Italy, just it's very small. But man, the architecture, the plaza, the cathedrals, the buildings are very, very, very powerful reminders of what state you're in. Now, if you look at democratic states, we know how, the leaders are elected. In socialist states, what happens is the political rhetoric emphasizes social equality. So, okay, let's go to the socialist states. The political rhetoric emphasizes social equality. That's quite different than here historically. And so you will find the leaders in socialist states generally not wearing fancy clothes, not having fancy cars. It's changed a lot in recent years, but they use the Mao jacket as an example. That regardless of rank, for a period of time in China, everybody wore Mao jackets, the leaders, which were very simple, plain jackets that Mao wore. And it didn't matter what their rank was because it was a symbolic statement of this anti-hierarchical philosophy of a socialist state. So that's an example of how symbols work in a socialist state. The leaders in a socialist state don't dress differently. And in comparison to that, they're showing you in a non-socialist state, in how leaders dress very differently. In a democratic state, the leaders don't dress differently. So the British royalty, for instance, wears street clothes, unless they're in their regalia for a ritual or a purpose, which is another symbol. So you get the symbol of democracy in wearing pretty nice and expensive street clothes, but street clothes nonetheless. And then you get the symbology of royalty when wearing the crown and, the regalia of royalty. So other things beyond clothing obviously are associated with leadership, as they point out. The housing, the queen lives in a castle, the president lives in the White House. And in democratic states and socialist states too, people tend to like people who are not all, elite and uppity in a sense. So George Bush is the example they give you. They thought of him as a regular guy. One of the people, because he liked to eat hamburgers, okay, they used to say, who'd you rather have a beer with? George Bush or John Kerry or whatever. Also, there are symbols of transportation that are very different with leaders in democratic and socialist states, but in democratic states. So you think about Air Force One, bulletproof windows and security vehicles. Those are all symbols of the state. So before we move on and finish this, I wanted to have you to be sure to read that section on Chief Joseph in Oregon and the last Queen of Hawaii. The last Queen of Hawaii, and I believe some of you are, students from Hawaii, was deposed by a group of European and American businessmen who took political control of the islands. And certainly we know what happened in America with the taking of land and political control of Native Americans. In terms of Chief Joseph in 1863, there was this discovery of gold in Oregon, and they promised the Nez Perce a very large, I think it was 6 million acre reservation, and they continued to relocate them, and it kept shrinking, and it led to a war of resistance, of course, and Chief Joseph was finally caught just almost to Canada, and he famously said, I will fight no more forever. And so it's interesting to see. I think those two examples are in this point to see the coercive power of states to what were, in a sense, well, one was, the Native Americans, the Nez Perce and the Band, that was a tribe level. And I don't know, the Hawaiian monarchy was probably at the chiefdom level. But you get to the state level, and those levels cannot fight back. There's no way to win in a situation like that. So let's now look at gender and leadership in states. Most states, even contemporary ones, modern ones, are hierarchical and patriarchal, and they exclude both members of the lower class and women from equal participation. Look what it costs to run for office in America. Now, you don't have to have all that money yourself, but you have to have the connections and an ability to raise it, certainly. And so it immediately makes it extremely difficult for people who are not, don't have some major financial resources. And, of developed nations, we have a very low rate of females. We had a huge influx, well, a large influx in 2016. Still, we're way behind with other countries, with industrialized nations with that. Even not all industrialized. Rwanda, of all countries, has the highest rate of women in positions of political power of any country. So some states are less male dominated than others, but none of them is female dominated. Okay. Women don't dominate. It's the same thing about a matriarchy versus a matriarchal society. Even in Rwanda, where I think women are in a majority in the upper political system, they're not dominating men. They're not making laws about their reproductive rights or anything of that nature, in that sense. And so that's a big difference. So one theory about this dearth of women in politics is, and by the way, before I go on to that, I want to tell you that Egypt was a great exception. Egypt was a wonderful place to be female, ancient Egypt, and also some of the women were rulers and actually became pharaohs. So and one of them, Hatshepsut, wore the false beard of the pharaoh, but all pharaohs wore a false beard, the men as well. So it's really quite interesting. So the theory about why women have not, why this evolution of states evolved the way it did, has to do with the increasing male dominance because of men's control of the technology of production, which means food sources, not growing it so much. The women have always been involved in that, but in controlling the distribution of food and the taxation of food and warfare. I used to teach women's studies, and I have to tell you about this cartoon. It's one of my favorite cartoons. It's Paleolithic times, so cavewoman times, and they've got their skin clothing on, and it shows two women standing on a plateau, and down below them are the men foraging, picking berries and things, which is just the flip reverse of what, of course, we think of as the women are the foragers. And the women are standing with spears, two of them standing up on the top of the plateau, and one's saying to the other, well, I don't know what could be the problem with letting men have weapons. Anyway, it's hysterical. And that when I wrote this lecture note, I thought, oh gosh, there you go. Men's evolution of states included increasing male dominance due to men's control of the technology of production. In other words, when the plow was invented, that was a huge downfall for women's status and power 5,000 years ago, and their control of warfare. So in most cultures, women have limited access to those areas of power. The technology of production and weaponry and warfare. But peaceful states, isn't this interesting? And that's the term your text uses. Peaceful states, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. The women's political roles are much more prominent. I put a short video in the coursework of the new Finnish prime minister. Now it's 3 women at the top of the government in Finland, all young, all in their 30s. It's just amazing. So I think you'll enjoy seeing that. But strongly patriarchal modern states preserves male dominance, and they reserve it and preserve it through ideologies that restricts women's political power. So if you think about the Muslim Middle East, Central Asia, Pakistan, Northern India, there's the concept of purdah, that the segregation and seclusion of women, veiling as part of purdah, segregation and seclusion from the public world, that the ideology that women just don't belong in the public world, which very much limits women's roles. You know, Saudi women just got the right to drive vehicles, I don't know, it was a couple of years ago, and they're still being stopped by very conservative Muslim men, even though it's legal for them to drive now. So if you look at socialist states, there has been a concerted effort to attempt to increase women's political roles. And in socialist states, the proportion of female members in a legislature is higher than it is in capitalist democracies. So here's a shocker for you. Maybe it doesn't surprise you. Women are, of course, half the world's population. They're only 25% of people in political positions, and those are not high political. We're talking about, you know, not leaders, but in other political positions. It's only 25% of women. Highest percentage is in Rwanda, which is over 50%. Countries with over 25% women in positions of power are either African or Nordic countries. And also, some of those countries that have high percentages of women have put in gender quotas where a certain percentage of the legislature or et cetera must be female. It's very controversial, as you might imagine. It can never happen here, I don't believe. But France has one, I believe, and some of the other countries. So the last question in this section for this week is, would having more women in political positions, change the policies? And I would say yes, because if you look at the countries where there are more women in positions of political power, they have certainly much better supports for families, for children, for parental leave, for supporting and changing food insecurity and housing insecurity, and a variety of those types of policies. So yes, I think it would. It doesn't mean that's exclusively all they would work on, but you know, today in politics so much people are talking about their lived experience. You know, Representative Katie Porter is a single mom. So she has a kind of different take on how you do the stimulus checks to families. Is why should single mothers with the same amount of children as a married family, same amount of children, get less money than the married family when the married family is going to have more money because they're both working generally, you know, those types of things. That comes from lived experience. And so that's the difference that it would make. It's not that women are smarter or better or, you know, any of those types of things. It really has to do more with what your own challenges have been in life and your observations. Okay, I will see you next week, and it's our last week next week. Amazing, huh?